Hey, hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining me today for another Tuesday discussion. Now, when it comes to these Tuesdays, these are responses to questions that we get either in the comments here at YouTube, over on Instagram, or from our Patreon. So, we've got a whole bunch of topics here coming up in the next couple of weeks I'm excited to get into. But the one that we're going to get into today was a question where I was asked if sipping whiskey has changed over time. Like, can I remember a time that things tasted differently, or what's different versus sipping it now versus what it was 5, 6 years ago when I got into this? So I thought that was an interesting question. I'm going to answer it in a few different ways, and I'm really interested to hear your perspective. So be sure to come back after this and let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on this question. But hey, thanks for joining. Let's kick off the show. All right. And while I'm chatting here today, theoretically, I will be sipping, though we know that I usually just talk and talk and talk and never sip. But theoretically, I'll be joining you with a hard truth Kentucky sweet mash bourbon. Spit some truth out there while we're going along with this topic. But going back to the original question, do I remember whiskey tasting differently, or did it always taste the way that I taste it now? And the answer is it is a different experience than it was a few years ago. Now, it's a different experience in a few different ways. So I can remember a time where, and this isn't a brag, this is just an Ohio thing, of course. I remember a time where my daily was Weller Special Reserve, and all that did was taste like, just a straight caramel sauce to me. Didn't get the cherry, didn't get anything else. It was straight caramel sauce with a little bit of oak on it, and I loved it. And I would usually start an evening with that. And if that was tasting good, then I knew other things were tasting good. It was almost like my calibration pour. But I can remember the initial notes off of that. And I actually logged notes before we were doing all this. I was logging my notes on the app Distiller. So I can go back and I can kind of read some of my notes, and it is really funny because the reviews went from being like one sentence reviews to then over the course of the year turning into a paragraph review. And then the year later, multiple paragraph reviews. And then I got to the point where I was like, why have I logged 500 reviews on Distiller? I should just do this in a different format and do it myself. And thus created the Instagram to start there, and then created this to move it forward. But I do remember tasting things different. And I have those notes that I can go back and see what I thought of something initially. Now, what is interesting, though, and I think this has to be put into context, the whiskey industry has drastically changed the last 3 years. When these craft distilleries started hitting pretty darn hard in 2019, especially 2020, especially 2021. I mean, the amount of brands that we have today that are producing good whiskey and producing it themselves. I'm not just talking about brands that are sourcing from MGP or Dickel, but we have really good craft distilleries now. And that's also why I chose the hard truth here, because most likely this is from Wilderness Trail. Really good. Well, people get mad that I call them craft now that they've been bought out, but still kind of crafty in my mind. You get a decade. Maybe that's it. But point being, there's a lot more flavor varieties, specifically in the bourbon and rye, than there ever was. And now we're seeing a boom in American single malts. So there's going to be a whole nother category there. So it's not just me that's changing. The whiskey is changing as well, especially as the competition gets harder and harder to stick yourself out on the shelf. I think the thing that changed the most, though, isn't necessarily my ability to taste. It's my ability to articulate what I'm tasting and actually understand it. Now, the best thing about tasting notes is who's going to tell me I'm wrong? I mean, someone could go and say, hey, your tasting notes are crap. Hey, it's what I'm tasting. I'm just saying the truth. I can't articulate anything else, right? Like, I experience it and I just let you know what I'm experiencing. That's kind of the whole point. And what I'm experiencing might not be the exact same thing you're experiencing. One interesting tidbit I got when I was talking about tasting notes with somebody in the whiskey industry was they're like, I'm not a real fan of tasting notes because different things taste differently all around the world or all across the US. A blueberry in California might taste different than a blueberry from Mexico and a blueberry from Florida, wherever the heck blueberries are from. But you kind of get the point, right? Like where it's grown matters. So my definition is probably biased by my local area and what's available in the local cuisine and the spices that we use. Even with that, still, I've seen enough cases now over time where I can talk to somebody, we can spit out tasting notes, we can discover each other's angles in what we're tasting and figure out what corner of the whiskey they're getting, or, oh, I can see how you got there, or, oh, yeah, I now find that now that you say it, because suggestion does matter. But the ability to articulate and to get those dots connected is probably the most critical thing to then being able to peer behind the curtain even deeper, because your mind is less confounded by something that it can't explain. Once it knows how to explain it, it can go that next layer and keep processing until you can't find anything anymore. I think a big example of that happened very recently on a live stream. We were with the Turks, Drifting Drams. Go check out Drifting Drams if you haven't. And we had a blind fright from Kelsey that was essentially all craft whiskeys. And they were all pot still whiskeys as well. And I have been going on for the last 5 or 6 years not understanding what that note is to distinguish that something was distilled, in a pot still. I would just call it crafty in my head. And I can never have another better word to articulate it. I would just say, oh, this tastes crafty. No, it was pot still. I just associated it with craft because a lot of times craft distilleries are utilizing pot stills. And what's been real interesting ever since then, this is just all happening in the last 2 to 3 months. I've been trying things, getting that note, and then looking at the bottle or going online and being like, nope, this is pot still. I know it is. And then trying to find it and try to reverse engineer it and see if I'm right. And typically I'm right now. Now I got a marker for that. So instead of me saying, oh, it's crafty and stopping, I now can articulate it, move forward, and appreciate it more. I have found that too. The more I can articulate, the better I appreciate. Now, one thing that's interesting, Kelsey and Darrell are doing reviews now more often. And, if you really want to listen and get into it, listen to how they describe tasting whiskey versus how I describe it. When we record ourselves and we do these type of videos, you fall into a process that makes sense to you. You're actually getting to see how our mind is processing the whiskey each step of the way. Kelsey, as an example, will really focus on mouthfeel and texture and how viscous it is. And he's describing an experience, whereas I totally lean into dessert flavors and I am just creating dessert recipes in my head on the fly typically. The other thing that really, really helped though over the years is that I have a good understanding of the extremes, in the sense that I've had some really bad whiskeys and I've had some really good whiskeys. And I then have the confidence to kind of know how to navigate in between. So that's another thing that I didn't have starting out. When you first start out, you probably, even if you were handed a top shelf pour, you might not fully appreciate it or understand how top shelf it is. And when I say top shelf, I mean by quality, not based on price. But most of the time, we're just exploring these categories starting at $20, $30, $40, getting more into it and finding a way to justify $50, and getting more into it and finding a way to justify $80 and $100 and $150 and $200 and $250 sometimes. I don't go above that. That's my limit, guys. That's it, $250. That's an extreme limit though. But yeah, just getting to know those extremes has also helped me in the tasting process as well, because I can tell when I'm tasting something special or something that sticks out, something that's well above the rest when you've gone through so many repetitions. I mean, at this point, we've got to be talking about 1,000 pours, 1,200 pours, 1,500 pours over the last 16 years of all different things. It's probably right around there. And you would think, oh, that many things, those many brands don't exist on the shelf. Yeah, but then you get into the single barrels. It's all infinite at that point. But the entire review format of the channel is kind of based on helping people, essentially extending a ladder when it comes to these tasting notes to help others articulate and define their journey. That is how I learned it. I would get a bottle, I would come back, to my house and I'd pull up Scotch test dummies and I'd see if they did a review. And if they did, I would sit there and watch the 10-minute review at the same time that I'm sipping on it. And I would see if I could find their tasting notes or not. And that just begins connecting the dots. You're essentially connecting the flavor nodes, the flavor sensations to nodes in your head so that you can then recall that flavor later, like a muscle memory. And the bigger your dictionary, the easier it is then to recall those flavors and to pull more flavors out because you've experienced them before. You know how to process them. And that's a big part of why things taste differently now. It's not just that they taste differently. I think it's just my mind's ability to break it down and articulate it. So the whole point of giving tasting notes on all these reviews is to just do the same thing for other people. Maybe all the notes don't land, but heck, 1 out of 10 notes lands. It's connecting a dot in your head and it's starting to build your dictionary. I'm just trying to help do that. So that's the way I would tackle that question, with a resounding yes. Do things taste differently? Yes. They taste differently, and I can articulate them differently, which also means then I'm remembering what I articulate differently than before. So if you are new into your whiskey journey, I recommend keeping notes, keeping a journal, do it in writing, go over to Distiller or one of the apps and do it just like I did back then. Because then you can go back and you can actually see yourself evolve as you keep up with it. It's very interesting. So that's going to be it for today's Tuesday discussion. Let me know in the comments, what has your journey been? How has whiskey changed for you over time? Why has it changed? What changed? Just curious to see your point of view on this particular question. And if you got a question for the future, hey, put it in the comments here, put it in the comments on Instagram. I'll get to it as soon as I can. Well, thank you for joining me today, whiskey friends. I'll catch you on the next Tuesday. Bye, everybody.
Jeff, just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be friends with me. But you have these whiskey friends, and you say hello again. Oh, Jeffrey, you should just be